My name's Pete Martin, and I'm a mental health practitioner with the mental health support team in Macclesfield. And I was going to speak for a little while about adaptations for working with young people on the autism spectrum and young people, and basically from my experience of my background, which is learning disability and learning disability CAMS. So yeah, thought a lot of these things are going to be, maybe things that are sort of like obvious, or sort of maybe you'd dipped your feet in beforehand, but I thought we'd have a look as we go along. I suppose one of the things I put down here first was, sorry, I'm going to move my glasses up as well. I wanted to share that, from my experience, Next Steps cards have probably been the most effective method I've found in working with young people on the autism spectrum. And it's just such a person-centered way of sort of like doing work, basically. And so I think that should be celebrated and not underestimated. The actual Next Steps website helpfully points out, like Next Steps is designed to support anyone who cares for children and young people. And again, I think that's the point, is that I would really urge people to sort of like just be brave and try and work with anybody. And I've also put there, because it's on the website, about the tools that it helps young people to communicate on their own terms and in their own environment. And again, my experience was that it really helped with conversations, and once it sort of like with their consent, sharing it with staff and with parents sort of like was an eye-opener in some cases. And that's because the visual nature just is such a natural thing, and such a sort of like a helpful format. So, here we go. Sorry about the glasses again. I thought I'd mention the obvious benefits, or hopefully obvious to me and hopefully obvious to you. Just that power of giving materials over to people just can't be overstated, really. Just the tactile nature of the cards. Like we've just had somebody coming forward to look at some other cards as well, and that's just because cards are just such a useful medium for sort of like young people to manipulate and sort of like, spend a little bit of time getting used to the situations, and sort of you just see people sort of like their curiosity and their sort of like just a few minutes allows them to just calm in situations, which allows you to use that meat in the sandwich sort of like opportunity. And for me, the other bit was that it provides a framework for me. Like I was going to say, I like to think I've got a bit of creativity in things, but really I'm not some freewheeling creative genius, to be perfectly honest, and I want a bit of a framework when I'm doing work, because otherwise I'd be a nervous wreck. So let's get on to some of the things I noticed. So having set the scene, I thought I'd just share a few of my experiences with just a handful of people that I've worked with. And one of the first things was combining of visual information. So anybody who's worked in special school at all might recognise this as a communication book. It's actually a piece of stock footage, but sort of like hopefully you get across the idea of a communication book. And it just plays a role in sort of like young people having a voice when their verbal communication is really impacting for them. And I put it here just to show how we combine the two, and just getting started using Next Steps, it seemed like an obvious thing to do. One of the interesting things with the young person that I actually worked with was there was actually no symbol in their communication book for I feel. And so, I feel like we achieved something just by ultimately getting that added into their sort of like their vocabulary of words. And so, yeah, because it just got me thinking about how would you, like how would people react if you had no way of communicating how you feel in your day-to-day interactions with people. So I just thought that was a useful thing to show off for people, and something to think about if you ever go back to sort of like your schools. My next one was just how I sort of like started off. So for me, I don't know whether people recognise board maker symbols. I'm hoping sort of like you might do in some of your primary and secondary schools sometimes. And all it is the adaptations that I made actually just started off by accident. You found that sort of like to widen conversations, I just had some board maker symbols in my bag. And I found that sort of like, particularly for younger children, particularly for children on the autism spectrum, it just allowed a wider conversation, and it sort of like made things a little bit concrete for them. So earlier on it was mentioned about, I think we were talking and there was a card for community, and it was like how you explain that by using some examples of what might be community activities or activities in your location. It started to make a bit more sense to them, so you got that shared understanding of things. And so that's what we did. It was really nice to hear that we are having blank cards made. I was a bit sort of like more low tech basically. I used sort of like bits of laminated card and sort of like drew things on them and stuff like that at the very beginning. But again, it just allows you to sort of like create specific things and things that sort of like you both understand in the conversation at that time. Okay. So I dug these out of my computer. These are just some examples of some ones I used with some young people. Left-hand side, you'll probably recognise. Actually, the beauty of the system was the sort of like the traffic lights just were really intuitive. Like a little bit of conversation with people, and I've never had a situation where the children haven't understood in some way the idea of the traffic lights. And so from that, we were able to move on. I suppose the difference is your right-hand side, is that I started using sort of like concentrating on just one card at a time, just because I would be going into sort of like schools where I didn't really know the person terribly well at the beginning. And so one of the things was actually spending a bit more time helping you create that sort of like that relationship with people, and just learning about all aspects of their life really was useful. And here's just an example of the symbols that we actually used. And yeah, some of the drawings of the young person, I think, is one of them sort of thing as well towards the top. I'll carry on with this. So yeah, I think I mentioned spending a bit more time, making things clearer to get an understanding of situations. In this particular situation, again, if you've got consent to talk with parents afterwards or with carers, that's brilliant. Because in this situation, it turned out that it was a bit of a sort of like, I don't know, a little bit of sort of like sibling rivalry with one member in the family sort of thing, which was the thing about family life. So sort of like, it just as simple as that sort of like allowed it to filter down and sort of like identified that it was a little bit about that. And then it allowed you to do some family work. I think we were talking in our table about whether it's possible to do some work with families as well in situations, and that can be a bit tricky. But actually being able to demonstrate with something like a photo that's the voice of the young person, it sort of, it felt a little bit easier. Okay. And My next one here is, it says conversations can be as long or as short as you want them to. I've actually written it on here. I said, if anybody knows what the heck I was going on about here, then if you could remind me, because it was a few years ago and it actually makes not very much sense to me at the moment. We certainly, we went through an awful lot of symbols looking at it, but I suppose for me, the thing to remember is that it's about a conversation and you don't have to be perfect all the time. It's like when you're chatting with young people, you sort of like, you sometimes go down wrong roads and sort of like, just, rewind and go back again sort of thing. Actually, just because somebody's got some communication difficulties, it's the same thing, to be perfectly honest. Although I think on reflection, they were very clear, they put stuff in the places. I think it's me afterwards where it's like, what the heck were we talking about? So, it is just a reminder of those things. But again, probably I would reflect on it and go, number of board maker symbols was maybe a little bit on the high side there and a bit complicated. Moving on to scaling. What I found was, and I think again I was sat with the table up there earlier, one of the things is with young children, often the opening part of working with next steps using the traffic lights is quite intuitive, and I think people feel really comfortable at that part. I think it gets, but it gets maybe a little bit more difficult when people are thinking about how do I scale these things. And I just thought I would share that I think I've had the same problems with other people at times. So in my case, I worked with this young person and I thought, oh, this is going really well. A little bit sort of like extreme that they were scoring things as 0 on that one and then 10 on the next one. And then sort of like, it occurred to me, I was going through different sort of like aspects of the life cards. And it occurred to me that they scored everything at either 0 or 10. And it was like, that's not scaling anymore. It's just sort of like, it's a version of the traffic lights, basically. And so, I ended up doing this, which is, it's really simple. I just created a line. And sort of like, I suppose if you wanted to, nowadays, I think, gosh, I'd have got those great big ones and had them walking across the floor or something like that to where it was. But what we actually did was just do a line, and it doesn't really come out in the picture there. I've just realised I used the actual life card there, but actually next to it is a little robot. Basically, that young person had noticed that I had an exercise book that had different robots on the front of it, and they just, their eyes were always drawn to it. So we ended up cutting that out, and basically that became them, and they walked along. I mean, later on, the irony wasn't lost on me that we chose a robot to talk about feelings. It was sort of like, okay, but it was, it worked for them. It also meant that since then, I've tended to, well, you could see my desperation at one point. It was sort of like using the traffic lights at the top as well to sort of like try and sort of like give some meaning to the scale. Personally, I tend to leave them there now, but I would say it's a case of trial and error for people. I was going to say, so I call it walking along the line. For me, again, one of the things that came up was that talk about maybe community. I found that family was a word, sort of like where actually I was a little bit worried about whether they quite got what the symbol meant. And so I played with the idea of actually using a board maker symbol that they were more sort of like used to, because it tended to be used sort of like board maker would use quite sort of like across the board in terms of the special schools I was going to. But actually I found that the kids picked it up in sort of like the situations where I did it. And I do wonder whether it was because we created that sort of like that grounding in the first part of what we were doing. So if we were talking about family, we were showing lots of symbols to do with family. So sort of like mum, dad, gran, adding names to them and things like that, and having the family card there so that when we actually did use the card, there was that connection already. So that was just one of the things I found, but I'd love to hear whether sort of like people have that same experience. And again, that idea of just putting the person next to the card so that they could actually link themselves to that and the actual scale that they were rating at. What else have I put here? So, yeah, I think it's been talked about. Just giving yourself time to do activities. I know it can be sometimes really sort of like difficult in sort of like situations to allow yourself that time, but it really does pay off. Here, I feel like I've jumped on a little bit with this particular picture because it did take quite a lot of time before we got to sort of like identifying steps of a plan. But again, it was that finding time, identifying cards, just being curious with people and just wondering sort of like what would be helpful, allowed people to sort of like, yeah, think about things, and sort of ultimately we sort of like brought it together. I do sometimes think where at times I was maybe being a bit sort of like adult centric sort of thing, but it's sort of like I try to reason in my head that overall it's around sort of an overall idea of being child centered. And it meant that some of the things that we actually put in there, I actually went on to sort of like be a bit practical afterwards. So where it was relax with this young person, actually we ended up sort of like almost role-playing relax. So I ended up doing you can get these things called spoken books, where you would put images into the book pages and you could record a message for each particular page. And so that was what I did with this person. So we actually did a whole sort of like 5-minute relaxation sort of like routine with different pages. The only thing about it is when you actually record yourself, I did, unfortunately realised that I sounded a bit like a serial killer with my voice when I was doing it, to be perfectly honest. So, I'd get a voice coach to do it instead. Maybe, I don't know, maybe Stephen Fry or something like that could do it for us. I also found that, if there were any cards that I personally found difficult to explain the concept to, it was things like energy and stuff like that. And so I would call upon Boardmaker at that time and just get some activities out that sort of like demonstrated using up energy. I don't know whether it was just the young people I was working with, but most of the times it was around them using up energy rather than lacking energy. So I think you would have to take a different approach if it was around people lacking energy. But then you would maybe use sort of like options, choices, maybe using blank cards to sort of like look at ways in which people could get active if they were sort of like lacking energy. So I just thought I would put that in there for you. As I said, this was where we got eventually. Actually, where we started was this, which was we just had one part of the plan actually there at the beginning, and it just over time, it's just felt the right way to go. So again, that's just how I found it, but I'd welcome people's sort of like ideas. And it was that I did one step of the plan, did it for a while and sort of like almost overlearned it, which I think sort of like suits really young children or sort of like young people I was working with a learning disability. And then often talk to families and staff where they'd agreed to it, so that they're just really parents, like we always say it, like we see people for, maybe half an hour or something like that while we've got somebody's interest in a session in school. Parents are there 140 odd hours in a week. And I was saying to a group I was sitting down with before again, that, with little ones, once they've left, you might have identified something that they could be practicing, but, they see a picture of a sheep and it just goes out their mind, or, it's playtime or whatever. And so if you've got parents buy-in or staff buy-in to just remind people, then they could practice it, like 10, 20, 30 times in a week, whereas sort of like, relying just on the young person is sort of like, it's counterproductive. So for me, for young people, I would really advocate talking to parents and just, enabling practice more often. What else have I got here? Oh, that was it. What time are we up to? All right, too. Thank you for your time, for listening to me. And has anyone got any questions that they'd like to ask at all? Oh, thank you, you saved me.
So, I really like the use of is it the board maker cards?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because I've never heard of them before or seen them. So I work in adult services for 18 plus. I was wondering if you've had any opportunity to use them with adults, or if they can be adapted.
In a learning disability setting, people would adults would recognise board maker cards. They're just so prevalent in sort of like special education that they would recognise them. Often they talk about easy read in terms of adult services for things like sort of like leaflets and things like that, where they use a similar format really, but they use general people. But yeah, I think they would definitely be suitable. I mean, again, I use that just because I would say there's even steps in terms of gauging it with a young person or an adult as to what they recognise and what they associate best with. So board maker, I think lots of people do it, but it's sort of like, it's generic, and that has its advantages. But for some people, it might be easier to just take pictures in the community and just sort of like, take things from Google basically, that would allow you to sort of like use the actual pictures and sort of, use it like that. Sorry, I was making assumptions about people knowing about Boardmaker. I do apologise. Any other questions? Anything that people thought, anything they disagree with or agree with from my experience? Oh, got a hand up there.
I really like the idea. Sorry, I've got a loud. I really like the idea of using a character to represent the young person. Choose a character to represent them. I think that's brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, over time, as I said, that was a spur of the moment thing. Later on, I just use a blank card and I get people to draw themselves. And so they're able to use their creativity. I suppose it becomes that sort of like that bread before you get to the sandwich sort of thing. People can, do a bit of drawing. I'm going to keep that forever, the bread and the sandwich thing. People can use their creativity and just have control of a situation. Is that okay? Any other questions for people?
Not so much a question.
Oh, yeah.
Not so much a question, more a kind of sharing of practice, if you like. Because I quite often work with primary age children, I find I have quite a large play therapy type setup, and I have hand puppets and Lego figures and things like that. And quite often children will identify with one or two of those particular items.
Yeah.
I feel like that would be a really good thing to use on that instead of like your picture or your
Yeah.
as a symbol of themselves, because that slight separation between saying me and saying that object sometimes is very liberating and really helpful.
And I think that's the nice bit is, you know, like use your environment. You know, like if you're in a room that's got sort of like a variety of things, then yeah, use what's around you to widen the conversation, because that's what it's about, isn't it? It's like, this is a tool that's really useful, and as I said, it's great for me in terms of it gives me that security when I'm actually doing my work. But actually, the skill is in what you're doing. You know, like you're brilliant at knowing your young people and working with them, and sort of like just using things that will engage them, because that's what will give you the wider conversation and allow you to learn more about them. Okay. Anybody else, or is everybody sort of like, yeah, beginning to think I'm really hungry or thinking and everything like that? I know. Sorry, I've added it into. Oh, I put it in the heads now. Okay. I think I will stop there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.